Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe and to hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications before we begin. Also, remember to drop a comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing right now. The digital age has ushered in a new era, one where the boundaries between online personas and real world atrocities blur with tragic consequences. Few cases exemplify this horrifying intersection more starkly than that of Trey Sessler, a 22-year-old YouTuber known to his thousands of subscribers as Mr. Anime. On March 20th, 2012, in the quiet community of Waller, Texas, the gap between Sessler's virtual identity and his festering internal darkness collapsed. He annihilated his entire immediate family, his mother, father, and brother, in a methodical prelude to a planned massacre that thankfully never came to pass. To understand the ending, we have to look at the beginning. Long before he was a number in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Trey was an aspiring creator. In September 2006, a teenage Sessler launched Lens Cap Productions on YouTube. It was the golden age of the platform, a time of raw, unfiltered creativity where anyone with a camera could build a following. For years, Sessler operated two distinct series on his channel. On one, under the Mr. Anime moniker, he poured his energy into reviewing anime series. These weren't the incoherent ramblings of a madman, at least not initially. They were passionate, if amateurish, critiques typical of early YouTube. He built a persona, quirky, knowledgeable, and engaged with a niche community. On the Lens Cap Productions series, he posted skits, short scripted comedy bits often featuring his friends. To the outside observer, this was a creative outlet, a way for a young man in a small Texas town to connect with a global audience. It offered a sense of identity and validation that his offline life apparently lacked. The devolution was gradual, almost imperceptible to the casual viewer, but retrospectively glaring. Over the years, the props in Sessler's skits began to change. The harmless accessories of amateur filmmaking were replaced by real firearms. It wasn't just that he owned guns, many Texans do, but how he integrated them into his content. The weapons became co-stars. He'd show them off, pose with them, and incorporate them into the visuals of his channel. Unsurprisingly, his skits became increasingly violent in nature. There were no real red flags, though, and a focus on the drama surrounding violence has been a mainstay since ancient Greeks wrote the first plays. In December 2011, a crack appeared in Sessler's perceived youthful invincibility. He uploaded a video updating his fans on a personal health crisis. He'd been diagnosed with a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung. While medically manageable, for a young man already retreating into a world of violent ideation, this reminder of physical frailty may have acted as a psychological accelerant. Criminologists often look for precipitating stressors, events that destabilize a subject and push them toward action. The realization of his own mortality might have fueled a nihilistic urgency to leave a mark, to control his death rather than be subject to it. Unlike most people who want to leave a positive legacy, Trey identified with villains, both in real life and in fiction. The most chilling piece of digital foreshadowing came in February 2012. Sessler uploaded a video teasing that Mr. Anime was organizing a quote-unquote significant event. In it, he told his subscribers he'd be taking a hiatus of several weeks. He was vague, mysterious. At the time, his audience likely assumed he was working on a major review or a much longer skit. In reality, this was a classic example of leakage, a phenomenon where mass attackers broadcast vague hints of their intent. He was announcing the end of his virtual life and the beginning of his violent reality. Violence rarely happens in a vacuum. It incubates. In the case of Trey Sessler, the path to March 20th was paved with acts of destruction that escalated in severity. This followed a grimly predictable trajectory known to forensic psychologists. Investigators later discovered that Sessler's violence hadn't started with his family. It started with the vulnerable. He confessed to slaying innocent animals, specifically family pets. Reports indicate he killed a pet rabbit and other animals like cats or dogs, using them for target practice. This behavior is a cornerstone of the McDonald triad, a set of 3 behaviors often linked to sociopathic development. For Sessler, this senseless violence served 2 dark purposes. First, it eroded the natural biological barrier against killing for no reason. Taking a life is psychologically difficult, especially when it can't be rationalized as being for food or for self-defense, and repetition makes it easier. Second, by eliminating the creatures his family cared for, he was practicing the emotional detachment required to eventually slay the family itself. The destruction didn't stop at animals. Sessler admitted to setting fire to a vacant home on Brumlow Road in Waller County the previous year, but he wasn't satisfied with just watching it burn from the ground. Forensic analysis of his laptop revealed that he'd used Google Earth to look up satellite images of the property he'd torched. He wanted to see if his destruction was visible from space. This detail is profoundly revealing. It speaks to a deep-seated narcissism and a desire for impact. He wanted his actions to scar the earth, to be visible from the heavens. It was a rehearsal for the infamy he sought, and a check to see if the world was watching. Perhaps the most damning evidence of premeditation was found on his hard drive. Sessler had been studying very dark events. He created a spreadsheet or list where he evaluated historical serial predators and mass shooters. He focused on subjects like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the Columbine shooters. He analyzed their weapon choices, their tactics, and their body counts. He was treating this activity like a sport, analyzing the stats, and figuring out how he could have the greatest impact. This gamification of tragedy suggests he viewed his impending attack not as a crime, but as a performance, a bid to enter the Hall of Fame of horrors he'd curated on his computer. To the residents of Waller, the Sesslers were a pillar of the community. But inside the home, the pressure was mounting. The father, Lawton, was a 58-year-old teacher at Robinson Elementary in the Cy-Fair Independent School District. He was a man who valued discipline and progress. By all accounts, including those by Trey, he was a dedicated father, but he had expectations. He expected his 22-year-old son to launch in some way, to get a job, to move out, or to contribute, or perhaps all 3 at once. To Lawton, slapping together anime reviews and increasingly bizarre skits wasn't the path to success in life. This expectation became the primary source of friction. Trey wasn't working. He was living at home, spending his days making videos and playing games. The tension between a father demanding responsibility and a son retreating into fantasy is a common domestic struggle. But in the Sessler home, it became lethal. Lawton's pressure on Trey to find employment was likely viewed by Trey not as encouragement, but as a threat to his established lifestyle. Rhonda Sessler, 57, worked at the Waller Times. She was described by co-workers as a loving mother who spoke fondly of her boys. There was no indication she feared Trey at all, and co-workers and friends said that she was always quite positive about his endeavors, even when his father wasn't. Mark, 26, was the older brother, and according to evidence, him and Trey didn't see eye to eye for years. His presence in the home meant there was another physically strong adult male, a potential physical threat to Trey's plan that had to be eliminated in his sick view. The events of that March 20th, 2012 were a tactical operation launched against the only people who loved the perpetrator. On March 19th, the day before the slayings, police received a report of gunshots at the Sessler home. When they arrived, they found nothing. In hindsight, this was likely a test fire, a dry run, or perhaps a moment where Trey almost initiated the plan, but pulled back. It was a missed opportunity for intervention that may have saved the Sessler family and prevented Trey from committing an act of true evil. Sometime before 1 p.m. on March 20th, Trey's mother, Rhonda, came to him with a mundane request. She wanted him to look at a dent in her car in the garage. It was a normal domestic interaction, but Trey saw it as a tactical opening. The garage offered isolation. It offered sound dampening. He followed his mother out. As she showed him the car, he raised a .22 caliber rifle. He didn't hesitate. He shot her 4 times at point-blank range. The choice of a small caliber weapon suggests a desire for lower noise, perhaps brought on by the police attending on the shots the previous day. With his mom, the family matriarch, down, the emotional center of the home was gone, and Trey was completely unchained from normal human emotion, if he had it to begin with. The sound of the shots, or perhaps just the commotion, alerted Mark. Trey moved back inside the house. The element of surprise was fading. Mark realized the danger and he ran. He made it to a bathroom and locked the door. This detail is crucial. Mark knew. He spent his final moments in terror, barricaded in a bathroom in his own home, listening to his brother approach. Trey didn't stop. He breached the bathroom, either blasting through the door or breaking it down, and he heartlessly opened fire on yet another family member. Lawton was in the master bedroom. Reports suggest he may have been asleep or resting. He was the primary source of friction, the antagonist in Trey's distorted narrative. While the exact details aren't fully known, what can be said for certain is that Trey entered the room and shot his father in cold blood. Trey wasn't done. In a disturbing detail revealed during interrogation, he admitted to retracing his steps. He checked the bodies. At this point, he became highly concerned about what he had done. He told investigators he didn't want his family to experience prolonged suffering. So, he retrieved a more powerful weapon and delivered additional rounds to each family member to guarantee they were deceased. This paradoxical logic, brutally slaying his family and then claiming to act out of a sick sense of compassion to end their pain, highlights the disjointed psychology of the offender. Psychiatrists would frame this as an act of ultimate control. He was the judge of their pain, and only he could decide when they had suffered enough. When police eventually entered the home, they described a scene of absolute chaos. The house was destroyed. Casings were scattered across the floor. But amidst the carnage, there was remorse. Trey had scribbled messages on the walls expressing his regret, declaring his love for the family he had just slaughtered, and asking for divine forgiveness. It was a scene of duality, the cold, tactical perpetrator who graded serial offenders versus the terrified child realizing he'd just destroyed his world. In his disgusting and vile acts, he had apparently come to the realization that he didn't want to harm anyone, not his family, and not the true targets of this event. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. It's time to jump back in time to earlier in that day. The slaying of the Sesslers was never intended to be the main event. It was just the prologue. Trey's ultimate goal was Waller High School. He'd fantasized about a Columbine-style attack. He saw the attention Dylan and Eric got, and he wanted to have his name beside them. These 2 sick puppies were the ultimate rock stars in his distorted worldview. He loaded his vehicle. He had an arsenal, including some of the same weapons used by Eric and Dylan. likely purchased as a disturbed homage to his quote-unquote heroes. He drove to the school. He was on the precipice of committing one of the worst acts in the history of crime. But then he just sat there. He looked at the school. And then he didn't do it. Later, he would tell investigators why. He said that after slaying his family, the gravity of the violence became overwhelming and visceral. This is a profound psychological insight. For years, Trey had lived in a digital fantasy. He said that he felt good when he shot down enemies in video games. He'd eliminated pets in the backyard, and it made him feel a sense of control. He'd graded the worst people in history and assigned them scores based on how many innocent lives they could extinguish. When he watched anime, he didn't root for the heroic stars of the show. He didn't want to see Goku beat Frieza. He wanted to see Frieza annihilate entire star systems. In his mind, violence was clean, cinematic, and empowering. But the reality of shooting his mother in the garage, of hunting his brother, of seeing his father's blood, it wasn't cinematic. It was messy, loud, and horrifying. The trance of violence was shattered by the brutal truth of what he had done. The horror of what he'd done to his family paradoxically saved the students of Waller High as the fantasy crumbled under the weight of the reality he'd created. Disturbingly, Trey claimed he targeted his family to spare them the embarrassment and shame of what he was about to do at the school. He didn't want them to have to live as the parents of a monster. This was widely reported at the time, but it ultimately wasn't true. Under further questioning, the facade slipped. He admitted they were simply the nearest available human subjects. He disputed the media narrative that it was about shame. He said if he was going to start his spree, they just happened to be the ones present. In essence, he thought in terms of his deranged spreadsheet and where he would place upon that list. He saw his family as 3 additional quote-unquote points he could rack up freely before the big finale. Psychiatrists opined that the shame motive was likely a lie he told himself to live with the act, while the target motive was the cold truth. But let's snap back to Waller High, in that moment of clarity when Trey realized he had already wrought enough evil upon the world for one lifetime. Instead of taking the usual way out, he decided it was time to channel his inner mint jelly and go on the lam. The manhunt was intense but short. By 9:30 that evening, authorities tracked him to a friend's house in Magnolia, Texas. The friend had no idea what Trey had done. When police arrived, there was no shootout, and Trey surrendered without incident. He was taken into custody, still in possession of his weapons and body armor. The rampage was over. In the interrogation room, Trey Sessler was a broken man. He gave a tearful confession, singing like a canary at a Christmas recital. He detailed the crimes. He expressed regret. He was placed on a special watch, a standard procedure for offenders who come down from the adrenaline high of a spree and face the abyss of their consequences. Unsurprisingly, a grand jury indicted him for the 3 capital offenses. In Texas, one of these charges carries an appointment in the chamber, and 3 makes it all but guaranteed. However, in August 2012, less than 6 months after the crimes, Sessler pled guilty. It was a strategic move to avoid the needle. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he's currently incarcerated, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. The case of Trey Sessler serves as a grim milestone in the timeline of modern crime. It demonstrated vividly and violently the Columbine effect. Sessler studied Harris and Klebold not as cautionary tales, but as idols. He adopted their weaponry, their aesthetic, and attempted to also take on their nihilism. But Sessler also represents something newer, the content creator killer. He left behind hours of video footage that document his descent. We can watch the light leave his eyes in real time, all while he attempted to maintain normalcy while eliminating innocent house pets, burning down houses, and other disturbed actions. We can hear the cry for help in his ominous foreshadowing video that no one understood until it was too late. In the end, Trey Sessler achieved the infamy he sought, but through some miracle, thankfully not the quote-unquote high score he so desperately craved. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to click that share button and send this video to your friends and family that enjoy true crime content. Also, don't forget that you can now check out Lazy Chill True Crime on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so be sure to follow and drop a rating over there as well. As night fell over rural Texas on January 14, 2001, a tragedy was set in motion that would take over 2 decades to fully resolve. That evening, 18-year-old Bridget Townsend vanished without a trace. Her fate remained a mystery for years, until an unexpected confession from behind bars finally brought the truth to light and set the stage for a long-delayed reckoning. On a cold January night in 2001, 18-year-old Bridget, the youngest of 3 children in her family, vanished without a trace from her boyfriend's home in rural Bandera County, Texas. Bandera County, nestled in the Texas Hill Country, is known for its rolling hills and ranches. The close-knit community was stunned by Bridget's sudden disappearance. She had been at the house of her boyfriend, Joe Leal, that evening. Joe was immediately a suspect, since he wasn't only her boyfriend, he was also a small-time dope dealer and well-known local hooligan. Joe said he spoke with her around 7 p.m., but when he returned near midnight, Bridget was gone. Her car and wallet were left behind, and some of Joe's cash was missing. After a frantic but fruitless search among friends and family, Joe called the local sheriff to report Bridget missing. However, defying all expectations on him by the authorities, Joe was surprisingly helpful and recalled absolutely everything she said and did. Interestingly, one acquaintance, 18-year-old Ramiro Gonzalez, denied having stopped by that day despite Bridget telling Joe he had come looking for him. However, with no leads, no signs of a struggle, and all of Bridget's personal belongings still at the house, it seemed as if she had simply vanished into the night. Despite intensive efforts by law enforcement, investigators came up empty-handed with no clues as to what happened. Some within the police department even speculated that this was a teenage runaway case, though tragically they would be dead wrong about this. For nearly 2 years, Bridget's disappearance remained unsolved, with little movement in the case. Then, in October 2002, an inmate in an unrelated, extremely violent matter suddenly cracked the case with a confession. 19-year-old Ramiro Gonzalez, the same friend who had denied seeing Bridget, was now in jail on another charge. He had been convicted of kidnapping and illicitly assaulting a 19-year-old woman in Bandera County and handed 2 life sentences. While awaiting transfer to prison, Gonzalez surprised authorities by telling the sheriff he had something that he needed to get off his chest. He had slain Bridget, and to prove it, Gonzalez offered to lead investigators to her remains. Deputies thought this was potentially too good to be true, and that he was simply attempting to get somewhere remote to stage an escape. But they erred on the side of caution and drove him to a remote ranch in neighboring Medina County. After driving as far as they could, they walked the last stretch on foot until Gonzalez pointed out the exact spot on a barren hillside. Sure enough, the searchers found human bones and personal items matching Bridget's description, including jewelry Gonzalez said she was wearing. The jailhouse confession had broken the case open, confirming that Bridget had been kidnapped and slain. During the drive back to jail, Gonzalez calmly explained how and why he committed the crime on that January night. He later said he decided to come forward because he felt Bridget's mother deserved to know the truth about her daughter's fate, and he already had 2 life sentences anyway. But his reasoning for doing so may not have been entirely altruistic, and Gonzalez initially tried to implicate others in the crime, including the boyfriend and a fictitious local gang. Ultimately, though, he would end up admitting that he acted entirely alone when faced with further evidence. With Gonzalez's confession in hand, authorities reconstructed what happened to Bridget. Gonzalez admitted he went to the house that night intending to steal drugs or cash while her boyfriend was away. At the time, he was only 18 and in the throes of a serious coke addiction. When Bridget answered the door, he forced his way inside. As she tried to call for help, Gonzalez overpowered her and tied her up. He stole some cash but found no dope. Determined to leave no witnesses, he drove off with Bridget in his pickup truck. Gonzalez stopped to grab a hunting rifle from his grandfather's home, then took the frightened teen to a remote section of his family's ranch in Medina County. There, deep in the brush, Bridget begged for her life, but Gonzalez illicitly assaulted her and then shot her with the rifle. He left her body on the lonely hillside and later returned the gun to his grandfather's truck as if nothing had happened. The later discovery of that rifle, matching his account of the weapon, further corroborated Gonzalez's story. In 2006, Ramiro Gonzalez faced trial in Medina County, and prosecutors were seeking to put down this sick puppy. Gonzalez didn't contest the details at all, rather he was fighting for his life at the trial. Prosecutors outlined the brutal details of Bridget's kidnapping and death, and argued that Gonzalez would remain a threat if ever released. A state psychologist testified that Gonzalez was likely to commit more violence in the future, supporting the push for a death sentence. The defense asked for a life sentence instead, pointing to Gonzalez's chaotic upbringing and potential brain damage from his mother's substance abuse during pregnancy. They noted that his mother was only 17 and had used drugs and alcohol heavily while pregnant, and had even attempted to cause a miscarriage. He was later raised by his grandparents due to her neglect, but then things got even worse. Gonzalez himself suffered disturbing assaults as a young child and began using substances to cope by age 11. Growing up amid such trauma, the defense argued, impaired his judgment and deserved some mercy. The defense also noted that he had confessed to the crime despite the fact that he wasn't even a formal suspect. They attempted to portray this as a form of altruism, but as I mentioned earlier, it appears that this may have simply been a way to victimize Bridget's boyfriend as well. After all, he had made the claim that Joe was in on the brutal attack in his initial confession, and only recanted that portion when his story simply couldn't match the known evidence. Despite these pleas, the jury found Gonzalez guilty and decided he should die for his crime. Bridget's family, after 5 painful years, felt justice was served. Gonzalez spent nearly 18 years ready to be put down for his sick acts as his case moved through the courts. His execution was scheduled and delayed 6 times over those years. One date in 2016 and another in 2019 were both stopped by court orders. In 2022, a federal judge halted one execution until Texas allowed Gonzalez's spiritual advisor to pray with him and hold his hand at the lethal injection. Gonzalez also asked for a 30-day reprieve to donate a kidney to a stranger, an unusual proposal that made national headlines, but the governor denied the request. He claimed that this was an attempt to make amends for the evil acts he had committed in his life. However, as you're about to see, despite this little stunt not working out in his favor, he would have his appointment with the needle rescheduled yet again. Despite having a number of additional years on Earth, he didn't follow through with his kidney donation promise when it wasn't tied to some form of clemency. Without turning this into a debate about the penalty itself, personally, I think that says everything you need to know about his so-called rehabilitation. A major development in 2022 bolstered Gonzalez's appeals. The psychiatrist who had told jurors Gonzalez would always be dangerous recanted his testimony. He admitted it was based on flawed data. Armed with this reversal and evidence of Gonzalez's good behavior in prison, his lawyers argued he no longer posed a threat to society. Supporters pointed to his deep religious faith and how he ministered to fellow inmates as signs of genuine rehabilitation. In a clemency petition, Gonzalez's attorneys also emphasized his transformation, saying he had grown into a peaceful, responsible man who was truly remorseful for his actions. Prosecutors countered that the death sentence was still justified, noting Gonzalez's lack of mercy when Bridget begged for her life and his long record of violence. Bridget's family was not swayed. Her brother David insisted Gonzalez's actions were unforgivable and that justice demanded the punishment go forward. In June 2024, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously rejected Gonzalez's plea for clemency or any further delay. The U.S. Supreme Court also declined to intervene, and the execution was set for June 26, 2024, what would have been Bridget's 42nd birthday. And here I'm reminded of that famous executioner's sword from medieval Germany that was engraved with a poetic verse. It said, and I quote, "When I raise this sword, I wish that this poor sinner will be granted eternal life." The quote is, of course, a rebuttal of the idea of these people who commit the most vile acts and then try to shroud themselves in the cloak of religion to seek clemency. On the evening of June 26, 2024, Ramiro Gonzalez was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He was 41 years old and had spent nearly half his life on death row. Gonzalez had expressed acceptance of his fate, once saying he viewed the execution as simply his way out of prison. In his final statement, Gonzalez apologized to Bridget's family and said he could not put into words the pain he had caused, praying for their forgiveness. He also expressed remorse for another woman he had harmed, saying he grieved for the pain he caused her as well. Bridget's mother, Patricia, drove 4 hours to witness the execution, calling it a deserved and even joyful occasion that would finally bring her peace. She also stressed that Gonzalez's troubled childhood was no excuse for what he did to her daughter. A spiritual advisor stood by Gonzalez's side in the chamber, singing a prayer as the lethal dose was administered. When it was over, Bridget's brother David told reporters they had finally witnessed justice being served, and that the day marked the end of a long, painful journey for the family. He noted that although it wasn't a day for joy for him, the act brought their family a small measure of peace. In late December 1991, the holiday quiet of a Sydney, Australia suburb was shattered by a gruesome discovery. A cyclist found a pile of garbage bags under a railway overpass in Arncliffe, and inside, police discovered the decomposing body of a young woman. Her body had been wrapped in plastic and dumped on a quiet street, suggesting the slaying took place elsewhere, and the perpetrator was disposing of the remains. The victim had severe head wounds, a ligature around her neck, and a wad of newspaper shoved into her mouth, a crime investigators would later describe as frenzied and brutal. Yet there was no identification on her, and her name and story remained a mystery. With no ID on the body and no immediate leads, the unknown victim was dubbed the Sydney Jane Doe as detectives scrambled for clues. It's rare for a victim to remain unidentified in Sydney, and forensic teams collected every possible piece of evidence using the tools of the time. They found 2 full sheets of the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper forced down the woman's throat, and 3 fingerprint impressions in what looked like blood on that paper. Oddly, they even found some animal hairs clinging to her clothes that appeared to come from a canine of some sort. Unfortunately, initial fingerprint checks found no match in the database, and the victim's identity stayed unknown. Because the body was discovered right after Christmas, investigators hoped someone would quickly report a missing loved one. But as weeks passed with no progress, they intensified efforts to identify the Jane Doe. Police released facial reconstruction images of the victim to the media, pleading for anyone who recognized her to come forward. The breakthrough finally came after a more lifelike color image was published in a women's magazine a few months later, and a friend recognized the face as that of Vivian Ruiz. Remarkably, it had been about 4 months since the body was found, and no one had reported Vivian missing because friends assumed she had gone on holiday with her boyfriend. This man would be the immediate suspect. But first, it's necessary to provide a little bit of background on who Vivian was in life. Once the Jane Doe was identified as 21-year-old Vivian Ruiz, the investigation gained focus. Vivian had immigrated from Spain to Australia as a teenager and was living independently in Sydney by 1991. She worked as a dancer in the King's Cross nightclub district, apparently using this as a means to save money for her dream trip abroad. That winter, she had told people she'd spend Christmas in Europe, which explained why her disappearance raised no immediate alarm. Armed with her name, detectives confirmed the identification by checking a King's Cross apartment lease in Vivian's name, and the fingerprints on that lease matched the Jane Doe's. They also contacted her family overseas and verified her identity through dental records. Knowing who the victim was allowed police to retrace her final days and relationships. They learned Vivian had been living with her boyfriend, Richard White, and the two had indeed booked a late December trip to Europe together. However, just before the departure date, Richard abruptly canceled the tickets and collected a refund. This was a major red flag. Richard, then in his early 30s, was a muscular ex-convict with a history of violence and was known to be involved in drug trafficking. He had met Vivian through the clubs in King's Cross, though the circumstances of this weren't clear at the time. Their relationship was turbulent, and friends later recounted vicious arguments and episodes of physical attacks fueled by Richard's jealousy. Now, in the wake of Vivian's slaying, Richard White had vanished into thin air. While the cops believed that he was almost certainly responsible, they also had to contend with the fact that he could be a victim too, given he was involved in a high-risk lifestyle. One puzzling clue had been present from the start: the fingerprints left on the bloody newspaper in Vivian's throat. At first, analysts found these prints didn't match Richard White's records, seemingly clearing him and playing into the theory that he may have been a fellow victim. But forensic experts eventually realized the print was an inverted impression. That is to say that the attacker had pressed the paper so hard that the usual pattern of ridges and valleys in the fingerprint was reversed. When viewed with this in mind, the bloody print proved to be a perfect match for Richard White's left thumb, instantly dispelling the idea that he wasn't involved. The animal hairs found on Vivian's body provided another crucial link. Lab tests showed the hairs likely came from a German shepherd. Investigators discovered that Richard White's parents owned a GSD, and that Richard had recently sold his van and left Australia around the time of the slaying. When police tracked down that van's new owner, they found bloodstains and dog hairs inside it consistent with the crime scene evidence. Piece by piece, the case against Richard was mounting, and they discovered a crucial lead. He had family in the United Kingdom. Detectives traced him to Newcastle, England, where he was staying with relatives. A warrant was obtained, and on April 29, 1992, British police, including Scotland Yard officers, arrested White at his relative's house in Newcastle. He didn't resist, though officers found he had scribbled a note to himself about convincing himself of his innocence. Rather than contest extradition, White agreed to return to Australia to face charges. He was back in Sydney by September 1992, under arrest and awaiting trial. Bringing White to justice in court proved to be a dramatic process. His first two trials in Sydney had to be stopped after he disrupted the proceedings. At one point, he stood up in the courtroom and threatened to kill the judge, forcing a mistrial. Finally, in a third trial in 1996, the case was heard to completion with minimal disruptions from White. Prosecutors presented all the forensic evidence tying White to the crime: the fingerprint in Vivian's blood, the matching dog hairs, and the blood traces in his van. The defense tried to cast doubt, arguing that those clues might have gotten there by coincidence or contamination, and White continued to insist he was innocent. And I must say, when your defense is arguing that the bloody newsprint with your fingerprint stuffed into the dead person's mouth was there by coincidence, just pack it in. You're cooked. Unsurprisingly, the jury found the evidence circumstantial, yet compelling when considered as a whole. In particular, the idea that anyone other than Richard White left his fingerprint and blood on the newspaper that gagged the victim was deemed virtually impossible. In June 1996, they found Richard White guilty of ending the life of Vivian Ruiz. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, the maximum term in New South Wales at that time, with a minimum of 9 years to serve before parole eligibility. The court concluded that White likely slew Vivian in a fit of jealous rage, although what exactly triggered the attack and where it occurred remain uncertain. This case would go on to become notable in forensic circles for the innovative use of an inverted fingerprint to secure a conviction. The dog hair evidence also showed the value of tracking unusual clues, which may have been overlooked by less thorough detectives. In the end, Vivian's story highlights the vulnerabilities of people living on society's fringes and how easily someone could vanish without immediate notice.